My daughter never called me mom after her wedding day. Not once in 11 years. And when she finally picked up the phone, it wasn't to apologize. It was to make sure I'd show up broken. The call came on a Wednesday evening. I was sitting in my corner office on the 32nd floor of a building I'd helped finance, looking out at the Atlanta skyline turning gold in the late October light. My name is Vivienne Cole, and for 11 years, my only daughter believed every lie her husband's family fed her about me. She was 23 when they started working on her. I was 64 when I finally gave her the truth she never asked for. The phone buzzed on my desk. Unknown number, but something in my chest, some old, stubborn muscle memory, made me pick up. Mom. The word came out flat, not warm, not angry, flat like a line on a heart monitor. It's Kayla. I hadn't heard her voice since the restraining order expired 2 years ago. Now it was measured, rehearsed. The way people sound when they've practiced what they're going to say but can't quite hide what they feel underneath it. We're having a dinner party, she said. Saturday. A celebration. Terrence made partner. I waited. I'm inviting you. A pause. Everyone will be there. His parents, his colleagues, people from the firm. I think it's time they met you. The real you. There it was. The edge under the politeness, sharp enough to draw blood. I'm sure you can find something appropriate to wear. I pressed the phone against my ear and let the silence sit between us for 3 full seconds. I'll be there, I said. Then I set the phone down on my desk and let out a long, slow breath. My daughter had just handed me the stage she thought would humiliate me. She had no idea she'd been rehearsing for my entrance. But to understand why Kayla looked at me the way she did, like I was something stuck to the bottom of her shoe, I have to take you back to a version of myself I barely recognize anymore. I was 41 years old when I married Leonard Cole. I know what that sounds like. 41, never married, working as a paralegal at a mid-size firm in Charlotte. My colleagues thought I was holding out for something that wasn't coming. Maybe they were right about the timing, but they were wrong about Leonard. He was the kind of man who listened when you talked, really listened, leaning forward slightly, like whatever you were saying was the most important thing he'd heard all week. He was handsome in a quiet, understated way, owned a small commercial cleaning company, 3 vans, 14 employees, a future he was building with his own hands. We were married within a year. My daughter Kayla was 11 at the time, already watchful, already testing the waters with every new adult who entered her life. She warmed to Leonard slowly, the way children who've been disappointed do. By the time she was 14, she was calling him by his first name. By 16, she tolerated him. By 18, she'd decided I'd made the worst mistake of my life. I don't think she was wrong about Leonard. I think she saw things in him I refused to see until it was too late. Leonard's business grew, not because of his talent. He was disorganized, impulsive with money, allergic to paperwork, but because I threw myself into it. I'd spent 20 years in legal offices learning how contracts worked, how disputes unfolded, how people with money protected themselves. I applied every bit of that to Cole Commercial Services. I landed the hospital accounts, the corporate contracts, the city hall maintenance agreement that tripled our revenue in 18 months. His mother, Roberta Cole, never thanked me for any of it. She was a large, commanding woman who wore her opinions the way other women wore jewelry, visibly and constantly. She called me Leonard's wife, never Vivienne, never Mom, even when I jokingly suggested it might be nice. She had ideas about the kind of woman her son should have married. I was not that woman. Too educated, too independent. Too old, she once said, loud enough in the kitchen that I heard it from the hallway. But I had Kayla, and I had work, and for a while that was enough. The unraveling started the year Kayla left for college. With her gone, the house felt different. Leonard felt different. He started staying late, taking calls in the garage, talking to his mother 3 times a day. I told myself it was just adjustment. Empty nest for both of us. Normal? It wasn't normal. When the business auditor came, she wasn't someone the IRS sent. She was someone Roberta's accountant hired on our behalf. Or so Leonard told me. By that point, he'd been quietly moving me out of the business for 2 years, taking me off accounts, changing passwords, having mail redirected. I didn't notice because I trusted him. That's not weakness. That's what marriage is supposed to mean. The fraud charges came 2 months after Kayla's graduation. Wire fraud, tax evasion, business misrepresentation. The documents named me as the primary architect of a scheme to falsify service contracts and overcharge city clients for work that was never performed. I sat in the attorney's office staring at my name on those papers like it belonged to someone else. Because it did. The scheme was Leonard's. The overcharges, the fake invoices, the side accounts, all of it was his. I'd had bookkeeping access early in our marriage. After that, I was kept comfortable and kept out, and Roberta, who'd always hated me, finally had what she needed to make sure I disappeared for good. My court-appointed attorney was a young man who meant well and knew very little. Leonard's family hired someone from a firm in Raleigh who had 20 years of white-collar criminal defense and a gift for making juries distrust women who knew too much about money. Roberta testified. Her voice broke twice. She described me as manipulative, secretive, a woman who had used her legal background to exploit her own husband's trust. Leonard never looked at me during the proceedings. Not once. Kayla was 23. She sat behind Leonard's family in the courtroom. When the jury came back, 11-1, guilty, she walked out without turning around. I received 4 years in federal prison. I served 3 with good behavior. I want to tell you that prison broke something in me. That's what people expect to hear. The dramatic collapse, the begging, the sleepless nights. And there were sleepless nights. There were moments I sat on the edge of my bunk and felt the specific heaviness of knowing your child believed you were capable of stealing from a city hospital. But here's what nobody tells you about being a woman who spent her whole life solving other people's problems. You don't stop. Even when you have nowhere to go, you don't stop. There was a woman in my unit named Harriet, 67 years old, former middle school principal from Augusta, in for a financial crime she also didn't commit but couldn't prove. She was the sharpest person I'd encountered in years. We played chess every Sunday in the common room. She beat me for 3 months straight before I started seeing the patterns. "You're still thinking like someone who needs permission?" she told me one afternoon. "Stop waiting for someone to believe you. Build something they can't ignore." I wrote Kayla letters. A letter every month for 36 months. I didn't beg. I didn't explain myself in circles. I wrote about small things. A book I was reading, a woman in my unit who taught me to crochet and then immediately lost interest in it herself. A bird that came to the same window ledge every morning at 6. I wanted her to know I was still a person, a real one, with habits and observations and a sense of humor that prison hadn't fully flattened. Not one letter was answered. I found out later, much later, that Roberta had convinced Kayla the letters were manipulation tactics, that my legal training made everything I wrote a calculated move. Kayla, who was grieving her own version of events, believed her. I don't entirely blame my daughter for that. Grief makes people need an explanation. I was the explanation Roberta handed her. When I walked out of the Alderson Federal Facility on a Tuesday morning in March, there was a light rain falling and a shuttle van waiting to take 6 of us to the nearest bus station. I had my release papers, $200 in gate money, and a phone number for a reentry program in Atlanta that Harriet had written on the inside cover of the paperback she pressed into my hands at our last chess game. Go south. she said. New city, new start. Don't go back to Charlotte. I didn't. The re-entry program placed me in transitional housing on the west side of Atlanta. I had a caseworker named Deb who checked in every other week, and a roommate who worked nights at a distribution warehouse and slept most of the day. I found work at a commercial cleaning company. The irony wasn't lost on me, where I mopped lobbies and wiped down elevator panels for $9 an hour. At night, after my roommate left for her shift, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started writing down everything I knew about the catering industry. It wasn't a random choice. During my years running the back end of Leonard's business, I'd subcontracted a catering company for a city event twice. I'd seen how the margins worked, how thin they were at the bottom, and how generous they became when you moved up market. I'd seen how many corporate clients signed annual contracts and paid without blinking. I'd watched the owner, a tired man named Eddie who'd built the business up from a church kitchen, turn away 3 hospital contracts in 1 quarter because he didn't have the capacity. I thought about those contracts for 3 years in a federal facility. I thought about what I would have done differently, what I would have built. I called the re-entry program Small Business Advisor, a retired accountant named Theodore who came in on Thursdays. He looked at my legal pad pages and his eyebrows went up. You've done this before, he said. Adjacent to it, I said. You got startup money? No. He told me about a CDFI, a community development financial institution that specifically funded formerly incarcerated women starting businesses. The application was 30 pages. I spent 2 weeks on it. Theodore reviewed it 4 times. I submitted it on a Saturday and didn't sleep well for 6 days. They approved $18,000. I named the company Third Act Catering. The name was deliberate. A third act in theater is where the resolution happens, where everything that was tangled finally gets addressed. I liked the idea of building a business whose name declared that the story wasn't over. I started with equipment I bought secondhand from a restaurant that had closed on Peachtree Street. Commercial mixer, 2 steam tables, a set of half pans. I spent an entire afternoon scrubbing back to usable condition. I rented commercial kitchen space by the hour at a shared facility in Midtown. My first contract was a corporate luncheon for 40 people, $1,800, booked through a contact Theodore made at his former firm. Nobody knew I'd been in prison. Yet, I wasn't hiding it exactly, I just wasn't leading with it. I led with the food, which was good, and with the service, which was flawless, because I had trained myself in that kitchen space for 3 months before I ever served a paying customer. The second contract came through word of mouth. Then a third. I brought on a part-time sous chef, a young woman named Josephine who had culinary training and a toddler at home and needed hours that flexed around school pickups. We worked well together. She was fast and precise, where I was methodical. Within a year, we had a steady roster of corporate clients in Midtown and Buckhead. I still lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Decatur. I still drove a used Hyundai with 112,000 miles on it. I wore the same good blazer to every client meeting, rotated my blouses, kept my hair neat. I was invisible in the way that most women over 60 are invisible in professional settings, which meant nobody was watching closely enough to see what I was building. But I was watching. Every contract, every payment, every renewal, I tracked all of it. I invested back into the business relentlessly. Better equipment, a second employee, a van with the Third Act Catering logo that Josephine's brother designed for $300. By year 3, we were doing $340,000 in annual revenue. By year 5, $800,000 with a full staff of 11 and a roster that included 2 hospital systems and the catering contract for a major law firm's client events. Harriet got out in year 4. I flew to Augusta to pick her up myself. We had a quiet dinner at a restaurant I'd catered an event for the month before. When the manager came out to check on us, I introduced her as my business partner. which she wasn't yet but became 6 months later when she brought her own set of skills. Logistics, scheduling, and almost preternatural calm under pressure, into third act as operations director. Some nights, sitting in my apartment after a long day, I let myself think about Kayla. I'd trained myself not to do it too often. The grief of it was circular, and it didn't help me build anything. But I thought about the girl she'd been at 11, standing in my doorway watching me negotiate a phone contract for Leonard's business, telling me later that she wanted to run her own company someday. I thought about the 23-year-old who had walked out of that courtroom without looking back. I hired a private investigator in year 3. Not to confront Kayla. I wasn't there yet. But to know she was safe. He confirmed she'd finished graduate school, was working in human resources at a corporate law firm in Atlanta, had married Terrence Ashford 2 years prior. The Ashfords were a prominent family. Terrence's father was a retired federal judge. His mother chaired 2 nonprofit boards. Old Atlanta money, the kind that made my daughter feel she'd arrived somewhere important. The investigator mentioned something else. 2 months after my conviction, Leonard had refinanced the business under his mother's name and walked away from the resulting mess through a structured bankruptcy. No criminal charges. No prison. They'd taken everything and paid nothing. I already knew the shape of what had happened, but seeing it laid out cleanly in a report on my kitchen table made something shift in my chest. Not rage. I'd burned through that in year 2 of my sentence. Something colder and more useful. Clarity. I told myself to wait. I wasn't ready. The business needed another year. I needed to be able to walk into whatever room my daughter put me in and have the ground feel solid under my feet. Then Kayla called. The celebration dinner was at the Ashford family's preferred venue, a private dining room at a members-only club in Buckhead called the Regency. I'd catered a board dinner there 4 months earlier. The event coordinator, a meticulous woman named Paula, remembered me warmly. I called Paula on Thursday. I need something a little different for Saturday, I said. I'll be attending as a guest this time, but I also need to make an entrance. Paula was quiet for a moment. Then, what did you have in mind? I told her. I also called my attorney that Thursday. Her name was Renata Okafor, 48 years old, formerly of the Fulton County DA's office, currently one of the best wrongful conviction attorneys in Georgia. I'd retained her 8 months earlier when a piece of evidence surfaced that I'll explain in a moment. I told her I needed a specific document ready by Saturday evening, notarized and clean. The document came from a man named Wallace Green. Wallace had been Leonard's external accountant during the years the fraud occurred. He was the one who testified, under oath, that I had instructed him to falsify the service invoices. He'd been specific, credible, and entirely wrong, either through deliberate choice or pressure I couldn't prove at the time. Renata found him to a financial records request 2 years after my release. Wallace was 71, living outside of Savannah, and had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure. He'd also, apparently, been carrying something heavy enough that when Renata called him about the case, he asked her to come in person. I sat in Renata's car in Wallace's driveway while she went inside. I didn't trust myself in that room. My presence might complicate whatever honesty he had left in him. She was inside for 40 minutes. When she came back out, she set a folder on the dashboard between us and didn't say anything for a long moment. He kept copies, she said finally. The real records. He kept them in a storage unit for 11 years because he couldn't throw them away. I stared at the folder. He said Roberta told him if he didn't testify the way they needed him to, she'd make sure the state licensing board got an anonymous tip about a separate matter he couldn't afford to have examined. Renata's voice was steady and professional. He had a daughter starting college that fall. He made a calculation. He sent an innocent woman to prison, I said. He knows that. She paused. He wants to make it right. He'll sign a full affidavit. He'll cooperate with whatever Renata files. She remembered herself. Whatever I file. I sat in that car for 3 minutes without speaking. Then I picked up the folder and held it in my lap the whole drive back to Atlanta. That was 8 months ago. Since then, Renata had filed for post-conviction relief. The process was slow, expensive, and not yet resolved. But the affidavit existed. The real records existed, and the DA's office had agreed to review the case. That wasn't nothing. That was the thread that, once pulled, might finally unravel 11 years of damage. But on Saturday evening, none of that was public yet. Saturday evening, I arrived at the Regency at 7:45, 15 minutes before dinner was scheduled to begin. Paula had arranged exactly what I'd asked for. My car, a black Mercedes S-Class, I'd leased 2 months earlier, the first indulgence I'd allowed myself in 6 years of building, was brought around to the main entrance by the club's valet rather than parked in the garage. 2 of Third Act's senior event staff, both of whom knew the Regency layout better than the venue's own people, walked ahead of me through the lobby, holding doors, steering with the quiet efficiency that comes from doing it 100 times. I wore a champagne-colored wrap dress in heavy silk, tailored the previous week by a woman in Midtown I'd become a regular client of. My jewelry was minimal and real. My hair was silver. I'd stopped coloring it 2 years ago and discovered that silver at 64 commanded a different kind of attention than the careful, apologetic highlights I'd worn when I was trying to be acceptable. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman who had built something. The private dining room was in the East Wing, separated from the main club by a corridor lined with framed photographs of past members. I could hear the sound of the gathering before I turned the corner. Voices, laughter, the particular brightness of a room where everyone is performing their best version of success. Paula caught my eye from the corridor and gave me a small nod. I walked in. The room held about 30 people. I recognized the layout immediately because I'd overseen a dinner for 26 in this exact space 4 months ago. Long table, a smaller bar set up to the right. Double doors to a private terrace on the left. Terrence Ashford, Kayla's husband, was at the head near the bar, holding court with 2 men in expensive suits. His parents occupied a cluster near the terrace doors. His father, the retired judge, was a tall man whose posture communicated that he'd spent decades being deferred to. Kayla was by the window, speaking to a woman I didn't recognize. She was 34 years old, and she was beautiful. My bone structure, her father's coloring, though I hadn't thought of him in years. She was wearing a red dress and her hair was pinned up the way she used to wear it for important events when she was a teenager. She saw me before most people did. Her face cycled through something complicated. A flinch, a reset, a determined return to composure. She had told these people something about me. I could see it in how the room adjusted as the nearest guests registered my entrance. Terrence's mother, Constance Ashford, turned first. She was impeccably dressed, mid-60s, with the smooth assurance of someone who had never once had to explain herself in a room she'd entered. Her eyes moved from me to the staff flanking me and back, recalculating. Terrence turned next. His expression was the most honest in the room. He looked surprised and, for just a moment, something else. Uncertain. I walked directly to him. "Congratulations on the partnership," I said, extending my hand. "You've worked toward it a long time. Kayla spoke about it often." That last part wasn't true. She and I hadn't spoken in years, but it served its purpose. His handshake was firm, and his eyes were wary. Then I turned to Kayla. The room had quieted by about half. "You look beautiful," I said. "That color is yours." She stared at me. Her voice came out carefully. "I didn't know you were, I thought you'd." She stopped. "You invited me," I said simply. "I'm here." The dinner began. I was seated at a middle position at the table between a colleague of Terrence's and the wife of the senior partner at the firm. Both were gracious, curious, attentive in the way that people are when they sense they're at a dinner with a subtext they haven't been given access to. I was good company. I always have been. It's one of the things I lost credit for during the years I was being erased. I can talk about commercial real estate trends and also about the best hole-in-the-wall soul food in Atlanta's West End. I can make a table laugh at a story about a catering disaster and also hold my end of a conversation about contract law, which came up naturally at a table full of attorneys. Constance Ashford watched me all evening with the measured attention of a woman trying to reconcile what she'd been told with what she was observing. The toasts came after dessert. Terrence spoke about the firm with genuine gratitude. His father told a story about Terrence at 12 years old announcing he would be a lawyer, which got the warm laughter it was designed to get. A senior colleague praised his work ethic. Then Kayla stood. She had a glass of champagne and a small, fixed smile that I recognized. She wore it when she was holding something in place that wanted to come apart. "I want to say something I've been thinking about for a while," she began. Her voice was steady. The room settled. "Terrence, you've shown me what it looks like to work for something good, to be honest and patient, and to build your reputation on things that are real." She paused. Her eyes moved to me and back to her glass. Some of us had to learn the hard way that not everyone operates that way. That sometimes the people closest to you can cause the most damage. A few people shifted. Terrence put his hand on the table. "I'm grateful to have married into a family that values integrity." She raised her glass. "To Terrence." The room echoed her. I raised my glass with everyone else. I did not look away from my daughter. When the applause finished, I stood. The scrape of my chair was enough to make the room go quiet again. Even Constance Ashford's expression sharpened. "May I add something?" I asked the table. Not Kayla. The table. I had spent 20 years in legal offices watching people win and lose rooms. This was a room. I set my champagne glass down. 11 years ago, I was convicted of wire fraud and tax evasion in connection with a commercial cleaning company I had built with my then-husband in Charlotte, North Carolina. I said it evenly. The way you state a fact you have survived. I served 3 years of a 4-year federal sentence. Many people in my daughter's life told her that conviction proved who I was, that she was better off without me. Absolute silence. 8 months ago, the accountant who testified against me gave a sworn affidavit to my attorney. He had kept the original financial records for 11 years. I reached for my evening bag and set a document on the table. Not the full file, but a certified copy of the key page. The kind of thing that means nothing to most people but means everything in a room full of lawyers. Every falsified invoice in those records bears my then-husband's signature, not mine. The scheme was built and operated without my knowledge. I signed documents I was told were routine. I trusted someone who had already decided to use me as his exit strategy. Terrence's father was leaning forward slightly. His eyes were on the document. "I'm not here to perform grief. I'm not here to ask for anything." I looked at Kayla then. My daughter, 34 years old and sitting very still with her hands flat on the table. "I'm here because my daughter invited me, and I decided a long time ago that when she was ready to be in the same room with me, I would show up as myself. Not as the woman your grandmother told you I was. Not as a cautionary tale, as myself." I picked up the document and set it down in front of Terrence's father, one attorney to another. "The post-conviction review is ongoing," I said. "My attorney expects the original charges to be vacated within the year." I looked back at the table. I built a catering company after my release. Third Act Catering, some of you may know it. We've done events at this club. A few faces shifted with recognition. We did $1.1 million in revenue last year, and we are expanding into event planning and venue consulting. I employ 14 people, 11 of them women, 4 of them formerly incarcerated. I raised my champagne glass. To Terrence, I said, and to the truth. May it always arrive, even when it takes its time. I drank. I sat down. The room took a few seconds to find its breath. Then Terrence's father started clapping, slowly at first, then with the deliberate weight of a man who had presided over enough proceedings to know what truth under pressure looked like. A few others followed. Kayla didn't clap. She sat perfectly still, looking at her hands. Constance Ashford caught my eye across the table and gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was recognition. Woman to woman. That was enough. The dinner broke up within the hour. I was walking to the lobby when I heard her voice. Wait. I stopped. I turned around. Kayla was standing in the corridor alone, her arms crossed against her chest, her red dress a little rumpled now, one piece of hair loose from its pin. She looked the way she used to look after arguments when she was 17. Held together, but not quite. Was all of that true? She asked. Yes, she exhaled. Not quite a shudder, not quite a sob. Why didn't you ever just tell me? I sent letters every month for 3 years. You didn't answer. Her jaw tightened. Grandma Roberta said, I know what she said. I kept my voice gentle. She was protecting her family, her version of her family. And you were 23 and you just watched your mother get convicted of a federal crime and you needed it to make sense. I understood that, even when it was destroying me. She looked at the floor. Then back up. I told people you abandoned me. I told Terrence. I told his parents. Her voice cracked once. God, I told people you were dead. You were hurting, I said. People do that when they're hurting. She was quiet for a long moment. The corridor was empty. From somewhere behind us, I could hear voices, the movement of a dinner party ending itself. I don't know how to do this, she said finally. I don't even know where to start. You don't have to start tonight. I took a step toward her. She didn't step back, which I decided to count as something. You could start by letting me have coffee with you. 1 coffee, no agenda, and then you decide. She looked at me for a long time. Her eyes, she'd always had my eyes, were doing the same calculation I used to see when she was small and trying to decide whether something was safe. Okay, she said. 1 coffee. She turned and walked back toward the dining room. She didn't reach for me, didn't hug me, didn't look back. That was fine. I hadn't come for a movie ending. I'd come for a beginning. The coffee happened 3 weeks later on a Saturday morning at a cafe in Inman Park that was half empty by 9 a.m. Kayla arrived exactly on time in jeans and a jacket, without the armor of a formal occasion. She ordered a latte. I ordered tea. We talked for 2 hours. She asked about the business. I told her. She asked about Harriet. I'd mentioned her in one of the unanswered letters and apparently that detail had stayed. I told her about Harriet's chess games and the book pressed into my hands at the prison gate, and something in Kayla's face shifted, moved by the specific detail of it in a way that abstractions never could have. She told me that Leonard and Roberta had moved to South Carolina 4 years ago, that Leonard had remarried, that she hadn't spoken to either of them in almost 2 years, for reasons she wasn't ready to explain in full. I think I already knew, she said, not looking at me. Not when you were convicted. I was too angry then, too ready to believe the worst because it was easier than believing the other thing. She wrapped both hands around her cup. But later, when I was older, and I'd worked in enough HR situations to know how these things actually happen to women. I think I already knew. Then why? Because admitting it meant 11 years of my life had been based on a lie. About you. About who I decided to be because of what I thought you were. She looked up. That's a hard thing to admit to yourself. I didn't say anything. I let it sit. We walked out into the November morning an hour later and stood on the sidewalk in the cold light. She pulled her jacket tighter and looked at me sideways the way she used to as a kid, evaluating. I'm in therapy, she said. Terrence and I both are. His parents, a small exhale that might have been a laugh. His father told him he admires what you built. That's high praise from him, apparently. I'll take it, I said. She hesitated. Then she said, the scholarship. I looked at her. Terrence mentioned that an anonymous scholarship paid for his cousin's culinary program 2 years ago from a foundation called Third Act. She studied my face. Was that you? I hadn't planned on that coming out. Not yet. I held her gaze and said nothing. Mom, she said. That word. After 11 years. She said it like she was testing the weight of it, checking whether it still fit in her mouth. It came out small and uncertain. Nothing like a greeting. Nothing like a greeting. Nothing like forgiveness. Just a word she was trying back on. I reached out and put my hand briefly on her arm. That's enough for today, I said. She nodded. She turned and walked to her car, and I stood on that sidewalk and watched her go, and I let myself feel the full, complicated weight of it. Not joy exactly, not yet, but the specific and irreplaceable feeling of a door that had been sealed for 11 years standing. Finally, slightly open. That night I sat at my kitchen table with Harriet on speakerphone, telling her the whole thing, start to finish, the way I'd told her things through prison glass and across a chessboard and over long-distance calls during the years we'd been building in separate cities. When I finished, there was a pause on her end. She called you Mom, Harriet said. Once. Barely. Once is how it starts. I looked out the kitchen window at the Atlanta night, at the lights of a city I had chosen as a stranger and made into something like home. We did it, Harriet, I said. She laughed, that low, dry laugh she had. You did it. I helped with the logistics. Third Act, Catering opened its second location in Midtown 6 months later. The ribbon was cut on a Thursday morning. The local Business Journal sent a reporter. I wore the same champagne silk dress I'd worn to the Regency because I've always believed in getting full use out of something good. Kayla came. She stood near the back of the small crowd with her hands in her jacket pockets, and when I looked up from the podium and found her face, she gave me a nod so small that only I would have caught it. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, after 11 years of building in the dark, the first real light. There's a moment I keep coming back to, not the dinner, not the document I set on that table, not even the word Mom after 11 years of silence. It's the image of Wallace Green's hands shaking when he handed Renata that folder. 11 years he'd kept those records in a storage unit. 11 years he'd lived with what he'd done. And in the end, the weight of it outlasted everything he thought he was protecting. That's how I've come to understand what happened to me. Not as punishment, not as fate, but as a chain of choices. His, Leonard's, Roberta's, mine, each one pulling the next. Roberta chose to protect her son at the cost of my freedom. Leonard chose silence when the truth would have cost him comfort. Wallace chose fear over conscience. And I chose, in that awful courtroom, to believe that the truth would surface on its own without me fighting for it. That last one is the choice I've had the longest time to sit with. I don't say that to blame myself for what they did to me. I say it because the only part of that chain I ever had any control over was my own link in it. Once I understood that, I stopped waiting for justice to arrive from the outside and started building it from the inside out. What I built wasn't just a catering company. I know that now. What I built was proof that your character, the real, quiet, daily kind, not the dramatic kind, is the only thing that can't be falsified. Leonard could forge invoices. Roberta could buy testimony. They could put my name on documents I never signed, but they couldn't fabricate 11 years of getting up before dawn, studying, failing, adjusting, and trying again. They couldn't manufacture the trust that Josephine extended to me when she took a chance on a 60-year-old ex-felon with a legal pad full of plans. They couldn't replicate what Harriet and I built together across 2 cities on nothing but discipline and the specific stubbornness of women who had already survived the worst. That's the thing about integrity. The real kind. It accumulates quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the way you treat a vendor when no one is watching, and whether you pay your part-time staff on time when cash is tight, in whether you tell the truth in a room where lying would be easier. I didn't walk into the Regency that night to perform anything. I walked in as the sum of 1,000 small decisions I'd made in the years when no one was paying attention. And Kayla, my daughter, who had every reason to keep her distance, saw it. Not the Mercedes, not the silk dress. She saw that I had become someone who could be trusted again. That's not something you can manufacture in a speech or prove with a document. It has to be built over time, from the ground up, the way all real things are built. Harriet once told me that the wisest thing she'd ever done in prison was decide she wasn't going to let the injustice make her into someone she didn't respect. That has stayed with me longer than anything I've read in a business book, because when everything else is stripped away, the titles, the revenue, the vindication, what you're left with is the person you chose to become inside the difficulty. Whether that person has any integrity left, whether that person thought clearly enough and worked hard enough and held on long enough to see it through. I'm 64 years old. I run a company I built from $18,000 and a legal pad. My daughter and I are learning each other again, slowly, one Saturday coffee at a time. And the woman who once cleaned office buildings after midnight so she could study real estate contracts by lamplight, she's still in me. I don't want her to leave. She's the one who got us here.